Imagine a murder case closed for more than a decade. The suspect has been convicted. The file is archived. The evidence boxed away. The town moves on. Then something unsettling happens. Forensic scientists compare old evidence with new crime scenes, and they discover that the same weapon that ended 2 lives in 1968 would be used again, and again, and again, and again. 17 years of violence. The same gun. The same ammunition. The same hunting ground. But the identity of the person pulling the trigger remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern criminal history. This is the story of the 1968 Signa murders. The crime that investigators believed they had already solved, and the evidence that quietly waited in an archive until it proved them wrong. During the late 1960s through the mid-1980s, the countryside surrounding Florence, Italy, developed an atmosphere of quiet fear. Young couples often drove into the Tuscan hills at night. They parked along vineyard roads and forest paths. The places that locals casually called lovers' lanes. The killer did not appear to choose victims randomly. Many couples parked in these secluded areas because they offered privacy away from the city. Young people would drive into the countryside, parked along quiet vineyard roads, and spend time alone together. In several cases, investigators later believed the couples may have been sharing an intimate moment when the attack began. That moment of vulnerability may have been exactly what the killer was waiting for. But over time, those quiet places become associated with a terrifying pattern. Couples found inside parked cars, gunshots in the dark, and the killer who seemed to appear and disappear among the vineyards. The nightmare appears to begin on August 21, 1968. That night, a car sat parked near the small town of Signa. Inside there were 2 people, Barbara Locci and Antonio Bianco. Locci's 6-year-old son, Natalino, was asleep in the back seat. At some point in the night, gunshots shattered the silence. Both adults were shot with a .22 caliber pistol. The child survived. Sometime after the shooting, the boy woke up, left the car, and walked to a nearby house, asking for help. When authorities arrived, they discovered the bodies of Locci and Bianco. Investigators quickly focused on Locci's husband, Stefano Mele. He eventually confessed and was convicted. The case appeared closed. But the crime scene contained something investigators did not yet understand. Several brass shell casings. They came from a .22 caliber Beretta pistol, and the ammunition was a specific type, Winchester .22 cartridges, marked with the letter H. At the time, That detail meant very little, but it would later become the forensic fingerprint of one of Europe's most infamous serial murder investigations. The blueprint of a killer was already sitting inside the evidence locker, but no one recognized it yet. When a gun is fired, it leaves microscopic marks on the cartridge case. The firing pin dents the primer. The metal slams backward against the breech face. Extractors pull the casing out of the chamber. Each firearm produces slightly different marks. In this case, those marks became the killer's signature. The cartridge cases recovered from several crime scenes showed identical ballistic characteristics. The same Beretta pistol, the same Winchester Series H ammunition. In modern investigations, these signatures are entered into national ballistic databases. But in the 1970s, Italy had no centralized system for comparing ballistic evidence between cases. Investigations were divided between different police agencies and jurisdictions. Files remain isolated. Evidence sat in local archives. The 1968 murder was categorized as a domestic crime and effectively closed. So when additional couples were murdered in later years, the ballistic comparison was not immediately made. Instead, investigators focused heavily on interrogations. Suspects were questioned aggressively. Rumors circulated, but the most important clue remained largely untouched: the gun. As the murders continued, the investigation took a strange and controversial turn. Instead of moving steadily toward the technical clues left behind at each crime scene, parts of the investigation began drifting toward more dramatic explanations. Some investigators began exploring theories that the crimes were connected to ritual activity. At the time, stories about secret cults and hidden groups were circulating widely in Europe, and these ideas began creeping into the investigation itself. This included speculation about occult practices and secret societies that might have been operating in the Tuscan countryside. The brutality of some crime scenes, particularly the knife wounds inflicted on female victims after the shootings, fueled these suspicions among certain investigators. Lead investigator Michele Giuttari became associated with these lines of inquiry as the case evolved. Some investigative reports suggested that body parts taken from female victims might have been connected to ritual ceremonies carried out by shadowy groups. These claims attracted enormous media attention. The idea that a hidden cult might be operating in the hills outside Florence captured the public imagination in a powerful way. Newspapers and television reports began describing the murders using phrases such as satanic sects and ritual unalivings. Headlines grew increasingly dramatic as journalists tried to explain the horror unfolding in the countryside. The public imagination ran wild. Rumors spread quickly, and fear grew among residents who wondered whether something dark and organized was hiding behind these crimes. Yet when investigators returned to the physical evidence, a very different picture emerged. The forensic findings never supported the existence of an organized cult or ritual network. The only consistent physical evidence remained the firearm, the .22 caliber Beretta. While the investigation explored increasingly dramatic theories, the most reliable clues were still the ballistic markings left on small pieces of brass, quietly pointing back to the same weapon again and again. Eventually, prosecutors focused on a group of men from the countryside. The most famous suspect was Pietro Pacciani. He had a history of violent behavior and was seen as capable of terrible crimes. Authorities built a theory that Pacciani and several associates were responsible. The group became known as the Compagni di Merende, or snack companions. Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Locci were among the men accused of participating. Confessions and testimony played a major role in the prosecution's case. However, many statements were inconsistent. Critics argued that investigators had become fixated on a group narrative rather than following the physical evidence. Meanwhile, the murders continued. The timeline of victims across 17 years included a haunting pattern of couples attacked while spending quiet time together in the countryside. Across these crimes, several behavioral constants appeared, forming a pattern that investigators would only fully recognize years later. The attacks followed a chilling sequence. First came the gunshots from the .22 caliber Beretta pistol, fired into the parked car at close range. The victims were usually finished quickly by those shots. But in several later crimes starting in 1974, the violence did not stop there. The attacker returned to the female victim and used the knife to inflict repeated wounds to the female victim's private parts. Investigators later documented dozens of stab wounds in some cases, suggesting a disturbing ritual or compulsion carried out after the shooting. These acts were brief but deliberate, and they became one of the most unsettling features of the later crime scenes. When detectives and forensic experts began comparing the scenes side by side, the similarities became difficult to ignore. Each attack involved a couple who had parked their car in a secluded rural area, often along quiet vineyard roads and forest paths where they believed they would be alone. The assaults almost always occurred at night, when darkness and isolation reduced the chances of witnesses. And most importantly, the same weapon appeared again and again. The .22 caliber Beretta pistol that left its unmistakable ballistic signature on the Winchester Series H shell casings recovered at multiple crime scenes. But two deviations stand out. In 1968, Locci's young son survived inside the car. And in 1985, The victims were foreign tourists rather than local couples. One of the strangest aspects of the entire case is the stability of the weapon. For 17 years, the same firearm appears to have been used, and yet the gun itself has never been recovered. Despite decades of investigation, searches, interrogations, and court trials, the actual Beretta pistol, believed to have fired those shots, has never surfaced in police custody or forensic laboratories. This creates what investigators sometimes call a forensic paradox. On one hand, the physical evidence is unusually strong for linking the crimes together. The ballistic markings left on the brass casings show that the same weapon was present at multiple murder scenes across nearly 2 decades. On the other hand, the same evidence stops just short of revealing the most important answer. The evidence clearly links the crimes, but it does not reveal the identity of the person holding the weapon, nor does it explain how that gun remained in use for several years without being traced, recovered, or definitively connected to a single owner. In recent years, advances in forensic science have reopened interest in the case. The new DNA techniques allow scientists to recover genetic material from extremely small samples. Evidence preserved from the 1980s have been re-examined using modern sequencing technology. These analyses have identified previously undetected DNA traces on some pieces of evidence. The findings are still debated, but they may provide the first new investigative leads in decades. The case has also gained renewed global attention through documentaries and dramatizations. One example is the Netflix series, The Monster of Florence, which explores the history and controversy surrounding the investigation. Yet the fundamental mystery remains. Who held the Beretta pistol? Was it a single killer? Or did the weapon pass between different hands over time? As new forensic tools revisit old evidence, investigators may finally answer questions that haunted Florence for nearly half a century. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a serial murder case is not the gun. It is investigative bias. When investigators believe they already understand the crime, they may stop listening carefully to the evidence in front of them. Assumptions begin to guide the investigation instead of the facts themselves. In the Florence murders, the gun told the same story for 17 years, but the investigation kept changing its suspects. Now, decades later, science is returning to the quiet clues left behind. A dent in a cartridge case, a fragment of DNA. Small details that may finally answer the question that haunted Tuscany for decades. Who was the Monster of Florence? And how close did investigators come to finding the answer in 1968?